time in 9 years, the Springboks walk away with a victory down under. And after the first test match against Australia, the Springboks and especially Jacques Nienaber came under immense criticism from rugby media in general. Some prominent journalists were saying that Rassie is the only person that can make the Springbok team tick tactically, that results are just plain and simple better when Rassie is next to the field in his waterboy position, and others said that Jacques Nienaber doesn't have the head coaching experience to be able to manage a top class team like the Springboks. However, in spite of this, Jacques Nienaber managed to prove his critics wrong and used an injury ravaged Springbok team to beat the Wallabies in the 4th round of the Rugby Championship. And how exactly he did it is going to be the topic of this video. So let's just briefly refer to the first test match, where we saw a very uncharacteristic Springbok team. If you look at where the Springboks played most of their game, they played it between their own halfway line and 22-meter line, which is very unusual for the Springbok team. We think of a Springbok team that likes to kick the ball, get out of bad areas of the field and put the opponent under pressure in their own parts of the field. But this quite simply didn't happen, and the Springboks chose to run the ball a lot wider and a lot earlier than we used to seeing them. And my theory on this very deliberate change in tactics is that the Springboks are looking to design a plan B for when the plan A kicking rugby fails to create this pressure that the Springboks want to create. Whereas a plan B would be bringing on someone like Willie Leroux or Alton Jantjies by attacking the ball flat, trying to put players into space and running the ball a lot earlier, passing in a more ambitious way, and not creating opportunities from pressure, but purely from aggressive running lines and creating space for players in and around the ball. And then came the injury prognosis, which was pretty bad for the Springboks. They lost Lukani Andre Pollard, they lost Pieter Stef du Toit, and these were the most notable absentees. And I think because of these injuries, Nienaber was forced to revert back to plan A because he didn't really have the personnel available to execute plan B, or he thought that it's pointless using this plan B if your first choice personnel aren't available for the test. So we saw a clear indication after seeing the team sheet of what the Springboks are going to do. And if you want a bit more about that, I'll refer you to my first video where I discuss in depth and quickly how this team selection impacted the way the Springboks wanted to play. Now, in the first match, Australia didn't really pose the Springboks a lot of problems. If you look at it statistically, the Wallabies missed a higher percentage of tackles. The Wallabies' set piece was incredibly poor. And the tries the Wallabies scored were all very much preventable. The Wallabies did take their chances quite well, but it wasn't like these chances were from incredible pressure created by the Wallabies. The tries just resulted from very poor individual defensive decisions, something that can be very easily rectifiable. And it's one of those things that you can't really coach in a game or rectify within a game. It's something that happens on the day. Just on this day, for whatever reason, the Springboks decided to make stupid errors in defense. But other than that, the Springboks were pretty much on top the whole game. They had more possession, they had more penalties, they beat more defenders than the Wallabies and made a lot more line breaks. But it was primarily the Springboks' reliance on running rugby rather than kicking rugby that proved to be their undoing, especially considering how the Pumas performed against the Wallabies in the second round of the Rugby Championship, where the Wallabies were all over the place in trying to field the Pumas attacking kicks and up and unders, and the Pumas creating try-scoring opportunities from that. So it's no surprise that we saw in the second game the Springboks from the get-go going to the boot, trying to pull the Wallabies wingers out of position and keep them on their toes, not knowing where the ball's going to go next, whether it's going to be kicked high on top of them or whether the ball's going to be wide. And accordingly, we see more attacking kicks and up and unders in the first 10 minutes of the second test compared to the entire game in the first test. But this then begs the question, why is this kicking game plan so effective against the Wallabies and not necessarily against other teams? And it's quite simple. The Wallabies just don't have the technical skill set to deal with a quality kicking game. And this is very well illustrated in South Africa's second try scored by Kane Moody on his debut. I mean, you can see here from the outset that there are 3 Springbok players chasing down this ball, looking to apply pressure as soon as that ball gets to the winger. The Wallabies don't really do a good job of blocking the lines for the chasers. The Australian outside backs don't really cover the space in behind the player that's waiting to catch the ball. And then finally, this personal battle between Koroibete and Moody ends with Koroibete not even jumping a centimeter into the air, and it's a very easy take for Moody. But even if Moody doesn't take this ball and this ball goes backwards, that Australian defenders are going to be under a lot of pressure. The Springboks will probably force maybe a turnover from that, or force an aimless kick downfield that they can use to counter-attack, or again start applying pressure. Similarly, Nick White was just very poor in exiting from the 22. A lot of his box kicks went barely 10 meters to the front, and up and unders in general for the Wallabies were very inaccurate and didn't really test the Springbok back 3. And in instances where the Springbok back 3 was tested, they dealt with it pretty easily. They got under the high balls with relative ease and stopped the Wallabies from creating pressure in that instances. The other tactic the Springboks turned to was trying to slow down the Australian ruck. That first game is a very good example of how Australia are a running team. They like to run hard, they like to run fast, they're very good at attacking gaps in a defense that's not really set. And what the Springboks decided to do is bring in Deon Fourie on the bench as the hooker in quotation marks. I think from the outset everyone knew that Malcolm Marx is probably going to play the whole game, and Deon Fourie came on for Kolisi in the last couple of minutes in the game. And Kolisi actually decided to do some fetching in this match, which meant in the last couple of minutes in the match and during the match, you had between 3 and 4 fetches on the field, which means that essentially anywhere there's a tackle on the field, you're probably going to have a fetcher assigned to that area, and he's going to slow that breakdown. And it's not about stealing the ball. It's just about slowing the breakdown, slowing the speed of the ruck in order for your defense to get set. And we also saw in this match a lot more one-man counter-rucking from the Springboks. It's not an attempt to regather the ball or push the Australians over. It's just an attempt to slow up that ball, get your defense set, close gaps if there's gaps that need to be closed. And that's why the Wallabies attack wasn't as devastating. The Springboks had lots of time to set up the defensive lines and make sure that the Wallabies are running against an iron curtain. But aside from that, the Wallabies weren't that much better or worse than they were last week. They actually improved their line-out quite considerably, and the Springboks struggled to keep their line-outs in the latter parts of the match. And you could see early in the first half that the Australians are starting to read the Springbok line-outs. The Australian scrum also looked a lot more solid than it did the week prior, and the Wallabies could generate good ball from their own scrums without necessarily worrying about conceding a lot of scrum penalties. I think the Springboks only got one scrum penalty, or an advantage for a scrum penalty, just before they scored their last try of the game. The Wallabies didn't defend necessarily poorer than last week. The Springboks end up having more or less the same amount of attacking stats, but what's absolutely crucial is the difference in how these two teams approach the kicking game, with the Springboks just being technically superior in that department, and thereby forcing pressure on the Australians just about after every phase of play. The Australians end up in the 22, they're unable to exit, and the Springboks just keep running at them and setting up more phases and milking penalties and setting up new set pieces, and that's just how the game continued. And you always felt that the Springboks are pretty much in control of this match. But probably the biggest talking point in this match is the big fight both teams got into just after Mapimpi's try, and this is why I titled the video V for Vendetta, because not only the second match but the first match as well was characterized by all these little physical battles throughout the two test matches. Faf de Klerk and Nick White, Alatoa and Eben Etzebeth, Moody and Koroibete in the second test match, Mapimpi and Koroibete in both of the test matches. And to me, what stuck out is that this was a game about revenge. The Springboks had their pride injured, and they thought that the situation requires a really strong answer and a really strong or good comeback from them. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in the second match we see a lot more confrontation from the Springboks. Now, I'm not in the change room, but to me it seemed as if the Springboks had a plan to get underneath the skin of the Australians, trying to dominate not only physically on the field but also mentally in confrontations, making it clear to the Wallabies that the Springboks are not here to be walked over today, that they are going to be feisty and that they are going to be aggressive in their play, and that the Wallabies should watch their backs throughout the match. And I think we can have a discussion on how effective this tactic is in rugby. I don't think there was anything malicious throughout the test match. It's not like someone swung a fist at someone else's jaw, and it's been on social media that Alato and Eben Etzebeth had a drink after the game, which is such a good impression to give of the game and such a good representation of what this sport all means. And I think it's the same for the Wallabies and the Springboks as it is for the Pumas and the All Blacks. Is every game in this rugby championship tends to provide answers to previous questions, and then along with it a whole new set of tactical questions about which players have to play, questions about what will rugby is doing with its laws, and it's created a very uncertain atmosphere for rugby in the Southern Hemisphere. But I think with that uncertainty comes tremendous excitement, and these next couple of weeks ahead are going to be so entertaining to watch. We might see Argentina winning a rugby championship for the first time in their history. We can see the All Blacks retain the rugby championship. We can see Australia perhaps winning it, or we can see a 2 bonus point difference between the team that wins the rugby championship and the team that ends fourth. And I think as a neutral rugby fan, everyone will be able to agree that this is probably one of the most exciting times in rugby history, a time where just about anything can happen. But yeah guys, thank you very much for watching the video. Please comment down below, tell me what I got wrong, tell me what you want to see more of, and if you enjoy the video, please like, share and subscribe. Have a good one.